Let's get into some news. We're not going to go into too much. I did want to talk about the NXT story. You and Kate covered this a lot on Friday night with the cuts, and we won't go specifically into the cuts themselves, but a bit more information that is now out there about NXT. PW Insider had reported that there had been talks internally of major changes for the brand, specifying like a new logo, new lighting, a focus on younger talents, and a different format to the TV shows. And then Dave Meltzer on Wrestling Observer Radio over the weekend painted like a pretty, I would say, bleak picture if you have been a fan of the NXT brand for the last 7 years or so, that it has really become this standalone property that has grown out of something that has been able to go to the Barclays Center successfully, that has got a television deal and has become kind of the WWE's outpost to go after the top independent talent while also mixing in with like its rising development. And I think it is those competing responsibilities that NXT has had that this has kind of come to a headway, and we're going to see how far this evolves to. But in Dave Meltzer's reporting, it was that, you know, the cuts, these were decisions by Vince McMahon, Bruce Pritchard, and John Laurinaitis, stating that Paul Levesque and Shawn Michaels, but I think the more important one, Paul Levesque, had nothing to do with the cuts this past Friday night where the 13 individuals were let go. And Dave went on to state that the mentality is that, this is off the Observer site, is that NXT is going to change in some ways, likely going back to the earlier days of developmental, getting talent that are younger, bigger, and could someday main event WrestleMania. And then Dave said, quote, "The feeling is that they lost the war with AEW and are getting back to going younger and bigger with the people that they're going to be going after." And said the wording he was given, like he read this, that no more midgets, no one starting in their 30s, and people who can be box office attractions and main characters. He did not state who said that, but obviously that is coming from, you know, that side of things. So I think this is obviously going to be something that this could very well be the mindset, that this is a big directional shift that NXT is going to be taking. And you can certainly look at the argument of like, what is NXT supposed to be? We lament the fact when we see performers that are brought up to the main roster and it's a completely different shift, some that really flounder. It's like, should this system be just simply streamlined to exactly the qualifications and parameters they want these performers to be ascending to on Raw and SmackDown? This is no longer a case of this being a third brand, any kind of equal. This is the developmental pipeline. And I think that's being made very distinct this year. And the question becomes, like, you have a 2-hour television program now. Can you go to such an extreme here? And can you I don't think you can make that change overnight either way. Like, you still have years of the remnants of this philosophy for NXT, that it's not like overnight you can just turn this into something where it is people that are a year into this business and completely, I think, eliminate yourself from the style that NXT has popularized itself with.
Yeah. I mean, it's certainly disappointing news, I think, for anybody who's enjoyed NXT over the past several years as this super indie. But, you know, if you're Vince McMahon, you have no interest in developing a super indie. Your efforts at it being sort of a way to kill the competition have not necessarily worked. The competition is thriving despite NXT's existence. And if you're putting as much money as you are into it and seeing, you know, whatever result it's seeing, whatever TV rate it's getting from USA on a Tuesday, whatever other benefits you're seeing from it, might not be worth it. You know, might not be worth it when your goal is to create the next John Cena or to create the next Roman Reigns. Why are you signing, you know, a Bobby Fish or even a Mercedes Martinez? And that, unfortunately, to me is, you know, very kind of flawed thinking, because, you know, you see on the other shows how much you can make money with anybody if they're good. And there are plenty of people above the age of 30 who might be smaller, who are really good. And I think, you know, could be tremendous projects for WWE or any other wrestling company who decides to pick them up. But we know Vince, he has his preferences. He has his style of wrestling that he likes. He has the superstars he has in mind to push to be their next John Cena or Roman Reigns or whoever, even their next Steve Austin or The Rock. And right now, it doesn't seem like the people that he let go fit that bill.
No, and if this is the shift, like it's very much a narrowing of the view of what makes a star. And I always think there's a big disadvantage to that kind of thinking, because often stars come along, and I think the idea you want is if someone gets over, they're over, and you run with it. It's not trying to fit your vision into this narrow box, and that is where your thinking comes. Like, you just don't know when someone is going to catch fire. Like this line of thinking, a Darby Allin doesn't exist in this system, and I mean, this only kind of benefits that viewpoint. I think it's a very limiting one when you're just forcing, like, it's got to be in this mold that a star is made, instead of the idea that you can't really define what's going to connect with an audience. It's just identifying when that actually happens and then going with it. It's, when the UFC, this is, a bit of an extreme example, but when they signed Conor McGregor, he was a very charismatic individual, but they had absolutely no idea that they had just signed the guy that was going to take their business to unprecedented levels. His first fight, he's on the Facebook prelims, but they identified it immediately. And by fight 2, he got a huge promotional push for that card in Boston. And when you saw him grow, it's like having the reaction that, okay, if you're a copycat, it's let's go sign some Irish fighters. It's like, that is not the reason. It's like, that is a benefit. He's going to attract an Irish audience, but it's not just strictly his country of origin. This is a superstar who happens to be Irish, and it's going to cultivate an audience, but that is not it is not exactly that's not the defining lesson from why this person is so popular. But they saw a star, and they built a star because they identified it right away and didn't try and tell themselves all the reasons this person cannot be a star or cannot. It was just, we saw it and we're going to get behind it. And in MMA, you have the handicap that this guy's got to win too and progress. We can only do the promotional side. We can't control the outcome. And that's always been, you look at pro wrestling, that's such a great advantage when you can control where a guy goes. Once the audience connects with them, that's the difficult part. And you just book them competently and enhance that reaction the fan base has.
Mm-hmm. Sure. Yeah. Not one person, I think, ever looks at a Conor McGregor and thinks, that guy's too small for me to care about whether or not he loses or wins this match. Nobody cares about that. It's such an outdated form of thinking.
Well, it's funny, way, because on the SummerSlam card today that I watched from 2016, it's the day after UFC 202 with Conor McGregor and Nate Diaz, which to this day is one of the most bought pay-per-views in UFC history. And Mauro Ranallo references it, and JBL, and this is JBL immediately reacting, but you could certainly extend this line of thinking, I'm sure, to some people in WWE, immediately says, yeah, but the difference is, and he's referring to the match that's in the ring for them. It's like Dean Ambrose and Dolph Ziggler. These guys are adult-sized. And I was like, that's your takeaway from these two that just drew a number that is going to dwarf anything you could have done in comparison. This is the network era. But it's like, if that's your lesson that you take, that, well, our guys are bigger, that size, the lesson is size doesn't mean shit when you have superstars. That is what the business lesson is. And this is 2016 when Conor McGregor has blown up. This is not like he's just on the come up. He has already achieved this. And your takeaway is the size problem.
Yeah, to maybe even just extend this to something else, I don't know how well this bodes for some of your smaller guys in an NXT. Already guys like a Ciampa and a Gargano, they feel like they're NXT lifers, and that feels far more cemented now. If they might even stay in NXT at this point, it makes you wonder. Somebody like a Pete Dunne, who's not that large.
He's the most interesting one because, we've seen the reports that Adam Cole seems to be, that is one they do not want to lose. Pete Dunne's a very interesting one because that is one that I mean, if they aggressively go after Pete Dunne, that's going to tell you a message. And if they give him, a minimum offer to stay or outright, don't, I mean, that's going to be very telling too. I think the Pete Dunne one, just because that appears to be coming up soon, that's a very interesting one to see where that one goes.
But beyond that, a Kyle O'Reilly, you name the entire NXT roster. It's like all cruiserweights, and it doesn't really bode well for how Vince sees them whenever he has a chance to perhaps bring them up. Can you, like, if he is unwilling to redo a Kofi Kingston run after the tremendous amount of fan support, or like, taking a talent like Ricochet, who was as much of a sure thing as I think anybody who's ever signed to NXT should have been to become a superstar on the main roster. If he does not care to use those guys to their full potential, what chance does a Kyle O'Reilly have? It really is a little bit depressing. And how is NXT going to change, from this point forward? Are we going to see more of a, just a focus on larger size, sort of stereotypical, Vince McMahon WWE level big guys? Is there going to be a certain age restriction for everybody in that scene? It's going to be a very different show, perhaps.
Yeah, and again, it's maybe in 6 or 12 months we're looking and it's not as dire as this picture is, even if this is kind of the line of thinking now. It's, circumstances can always change things based on what your needs are today versus what they are tomorrow. And, when you cite a Kyle O'Reilly or a Johnny Gargano, you still have a 2-hour show to fill. And that's like it's going to get very bleak if you're just focusing 2 hours on inexperienced talent that are, in their first 3 years, and they're being put in these situations to carry segments, carry matches. Like, you are going to need some of these core talents, I think, to help you put together a 2-hour show every week that's compelling, that doesn't drive your audience away. But
will they ever become champion? Will they ever receive the type of spotlight and focus that, they might at this point, or maybe they might have a year ago, if the goal is to use NXT to build your next John Cena level star?
No, I think that's going to be the decision, is that if you are a Johnny Gargano, it's like, are there main event or are there main roster plans for me, or is this it? And if this is it, is my future here? Like, that's going to put these performers kind of like, where do I stand in this? And, it's one thing to be told, hey, you don't have to worry about this, or this is overblown, but the proof is going to be in the pudding when we see 6 months down the road where this brand is. And I'll say next week, a guy who's in a very interesting position of how he kind of has to play this is Paul Levesque, who traditionally does the pre-takeover media call. And I don't know how this isn't the topic of discussion. And we've seen Paul Levesque these last few calls, like, he has been, just less cool under pressure when, a lot of the questions have been directed about, different NXT. The bloom has been off the rose. I think like these past 2 years has done some damage to this brand. And with this idea of what is the future, I think Paul Levesque, he pretty much has to be a good soldier and go out and put as positive a picture out next week to kind of lessen this concern that the audience has. But I think a lot of people will also take that with a grain of salt, whatever he comes out and says. He is not going to, I think, paint a dark picture by any stretch. His face is still going to be the one out selling this product.
It's his version of the investor calls. How can we spin whatever news we have to sound as positive as possible? That's sort of the game. Do you think that this entire thing will have maybe a lasting detrimental effect on, all the chatter that's been out there for the past several years of him being Vince's, next in line?
It's, he is someone that I would say, like, we're going to see in, I would say, like, the next year or two, like, where NXT fits into WWE's portfolio, like how big, like, we saw where this had become a significant brand for them, something that with all this money that is spent on WrestleMania weekend, they carved out their night that, a takeover was going to be part of your weekend to compete with all these other groups out there. This kind of viewpoint, like, if it is as big of a change as people are expecting, I don't know if this is the same kind of attraction to people, that you can take this in the same way like, that's the other thing, is that for so long, it's like this form of professional wrestling has been looked at towards a niche audience, but this is a brand that has been, with the WWE muscle behind it, they have been able to make a lot of money off of this brand, from touring to a television deal. Like, we don't know the exact amount that they're getting from USA, but look at all the shows WWE has produced that have not gotten off the ground. It's like no one's beating down their door to get main event. Mixed match challenge, even Tough Enough, when they brought it back, it got a season on USA, didn't come back. Like, NXT was able to get on USA. They quietly got a renewal back in March, but again, for how much, that's up for discussion. But it's like, I would not look at this like this was a failed Wednesday night opposition for AEW, but was it a failed brand? I would argue no. But if you are a Vince McMahon and you're looking at what is the point of this thing, it is to feed Raw and SmackDown. And they can maybe look at, listen, we're creating our own lane aside from AEW. We are not competing with AEW anymore, as much as you can spin that. And getting back to your question about Paul Levesque, like, that is like his role in this company as, a future leader. I think that's really a hard question to answer if he is viewed as the fall guy for this Wednesday night fight. That, like, this was a big opportunity, as much as this period solidified Tony Khan as like a pretty intelligent booker who didn't have any, booking experience in the industry prior, who got that renewal with TNT. I mean, he has really made his wrestling reputation in these 2 years, and Paul Levesque was on the other side of that equation.
Mm-hmm. And we haven't even brought up some of those other shows like an NXT UK. What does it mean for a 205 Live if the new focus is going to be on bigger men? What does that make that show feel like? Is there a need for that roster?
Who's left on 205 Live after Friday as well? Like, you had, Leon Ruff and Ari Sterling, who were on Friday's show, that were gone. It's another show that it's just, it's fulfilling content that could disappear tomorrow if they no longer see a need for it. It brings into question everything that Brandon and I recently talked about, is like, what is this overall global strategy for them? Like, I would say, this kind of changes the perspective of this idea of all these NXT satellite groups, and yeah, like, the NXT UK subject is an interesting one. Like, what is the purpose of NXT UK? It's got a TV deal in BT Sports, so I mean, there is, like, again, it's not something that's just a self-fulfilling project that you have. Like, you do have partners attached to that brand, but what is your ultimate goal for that show?
The creation of the network seemed to propel much of the strategy for their global expansion, putting pockets of shows here and there, and partially to justify being able to, fill this network with new content. Now you got this Peacock deal. You no longer really have that need anymore. And so what is going to be the ramifications for, some of these international projects? Clearly, global localization is something they've abandoned. Unless we're talking maybe something in India, perhaps, but I don't really see them doing much outside, perhaps, of that.
Nick Khan mentioned the idea of Mexico as well. Like, he said that several months ago, the idea of building something up in Mexico. But yeah, it's all, it just seems like a different strategy now than it certainly seems like the philosophies of, like, the George Barrios, Michelle Wilson era with this current one are just so diametrically opposed. And it feels like NXT is right in the middle of this identity crisis. And I don't know if this shifts all the way back to where we were, like, pre-WWE Network with NXT. And maybe it's somewhere in the middle, where you might remember that, when Kevin Owens and Bobby Roode and Samoa Joe were coming in, they were never earmarked for the main roster. It was like, these are going to be NXT talents that are there to help the younger talent work with experienced guys, get them that. It was still focused on the younger talent. And then you had this, I don't want to say phenomenon. It might be going too far, but suddenly, like, this became a hot brand that we could tour, but we have kind of set the bar that, it's high quality matches, and we need the talent that is going to be your most experienced on the indie scene. They were the best suited for this, while a guy like an Omos is not going to fit into that version of NXT. But today, I would say developing and rising an Omos in that system is much more important than going out and having a 4.5-star match on Takeover. Like, from the sounds of things, it's like if you are Vince McMahon, you want to be developing those stars rather than, having great, highly acclaimed matches. It's where can we get our next stars? And it just seems like we have a much more narrow view than we did a year ago of what a star can be.
You never want to hear about, talents losing their livelihood, maybe losing out on a lot of their dreams when they initially get courted by the WWE and sign those contracts. At the same time, I mean, for all the talk of like the indies shrinking many years ago with WWE hoarding all this talent, there stands to be a lot of really hot indie shows in the future with a great amount of talents coming out, because AEW is not going to pick everybody up. Even Impact and MLW, and ROH, they can only pick up so many people. But the scene is about to get really, really full, it seems, of talented guys again.
It was, in all of this, I think it's really interesting, the finish that you book at TakeOver between Karrion Kross and Samoa Joe, because just basic thinking is, okay, Karrion Kross is leaving NXT, you get the title off of him. We saw tonight, they are obviously, you can certainly disagree with how they called up Karrion Kross, but it is clear they have plans for Karrion Kross. They had a very poor way to go about that in his first match, but they're clearly going with this guy. What advantage is it to them that this guy puts over Samoa Joe at TakeOver? What obligation do we have to the sanctity of this NXT championship that we have already treated awful on the main roster? That's your problem. You are not beating one of our monsters that we are about to get behind in a big way on Raw. You guys can do a disputed finish. That's it. The NXT title is not a priority for us. So you book this match, you book your way out of it. I don't know if it's just a guarantee that Joe goes over and this NXT title moves on. It's do they want Kross losing? It's one thing that, while it's our story that he loses by fluke, it's a much different one that he does a highly competitive match and loses to a guy that is not on the main roster. He's a guy we actually released.
Yeah, much of that question, I think, comes down to how much Vince even cares about what takes place on NXT, whether or not he even pays attention half the time. I feel like there's no other
This means he obviously does, I would say. If all of this is coming out, I would say he's definitely aware of it now.
I suppose so, yeah. But, I would say I have to think it's a pretty sure bet that Kross does not leave TakeOver with the championship. Seeing the way he is booked on this show, I feel like they're trying to do everything in their power to get that belt off of him so that your entire show doesn't continue to suffer from this man's poor booking. Tonight included, let's be honest here. The man has a 500 record on Raw, has trouble beating Jeff Hardy, a low-carded member of the Raw roster. So I whether or not it's a clean finish, I do think Kross leaves NXT without the belt.